All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the first of two informational sessions on the Statewide Needs Assessment. Before we begin, I'm going to get started with a couple of logistical announcements. CalRecycle has Spanish interpretation of this meeting available for those of you participating in person or remotely. We have Spanish interpretation headsets for those of you in the room. Ask our team for a translation device. If you are participating on Zoom, just click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom window and select the appropriate language. CalRecycle is also simulcasting the meeting in English and Spanish. Just go to the link on your screen and select the English or Spanish webcast. Next slide, please. We have a disclaimer to disclose. While I will not be reading the entirety of the disclaimer, we wanted to highlight that information presented in today's workshop is based on current and known facts and is subject to change. Recipients of this communication are encouraged to seek the assistance of legal counsel to comply with applicable state law based on current facts and circumstances. Next slide, please. The purpose of today's informational session is to present findings from the recently published statewide needs assessment for SB 54. This workshop will not address any topics pertaining to regulations or draft regulatory text. There will be a question and answer session after the CalRecycle presentations. There will be 3 ways to ask questions or comment. If you are in person, please line up at the podium. If you are on Zoom, you can raise your hand to make an oral comment and use the chat box to make a written comment.
In the event of a fire alarm, we are required to evacuate. Take your valuables and use exit signs. Do not use the elevators. If you cannot use stairs, you will be directed to a protected vestibule inside a stairwell. If relocated, exercise caution while crossing the street. En caso de que suene la alarma de incendios, es necesario evacuar. Tome sus objetos de valor y siga las señales de salida. No utilice los elevadores. Si no puede usar las escaleras, será dirigido a un vestíbulo protector. Si es reubicado, tenga cuidado al cruzar la calle. In the event of a fire.
All right, so today's agenda will start with opening remarks from CalRecycle's policy director. After that, a series of short CalRecycle presentations will provide information on the needs assessment, as well as 3 of the studies that explored source reduction, reuse, and refill requirements. After the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Policy Director Linnea Whitney-Skierski for opening remarks.
Dan. Okay, there we go. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for today's info session on the SB 54 Statewide Needs Assessment. We appreciate the broad range of stakeholders here tuning in, and we know that there are many different interests and perspectives on what these studies include and how they should inform investments in the state. It's important to underscore that the needs assessment is not a set of instructions or mandates, but rather it provides a landscape of possibilities, data-informed opportunities that can help guide planning, investment, and action across California. What excites me the most is that this assessment gives us something we've never had before, a comprehensive public look at how our systems function today and what pathways could support meaningful progress towards reducing plastic pollution. These insights can help communities, businesses, and organizations across the state identify opportunities that align with their needs and capacities, supporting innovation and building momentum towards a more circular economy. Today's focus on source reduction is especially promising, as it highlights strategies and meaningful opportunities to scale solutions that work for all Californians equitably. For that, I'll hand it back to Dan. We're excited to get started.
All right, thank you, Linnea. So with that, I'm going to be turning it over to Priya Balasubramanian to present the statewide needs assessment overview.
Thank you, Dan and Linnea. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Priya Balasubramanian, and I'm a senior environmental scientist supervisor in the Packaging Extended Producer Responsibility section, helping to implement SB 54. I will be presenting an overview of the statewide needs assessment today. I'm going to start today with a refresher of the main requirements of the Act. Assessing how to meet those requirements was the foundation of the needs assessment. The Act establishes recycling rate requirements and source reduction requirements for plastic covered material, and recyclability and compostability requirements for covered material that kick in at various milestone years that I will now walk through. By 2027, the Act requires producers to source reduce plastic covered material by 10% relative to the source reduction baseline established by CalRecycle. This requirement moves up to a 20% reduction by 2030 and a 25% reduction by 2032. Plastic covered material must achieve a recycling rate of 30% on or after January 1st, 2028. This moves up to 40% on or after January 1st, 2030, and 65% on or after January 1st, 2032. The Act also requires all covered material to be recyclable or compostable or eligible to be labeled compostable on or after January 1st, 2032. Next slide, please. The purpose of the needs assessment was to investigate pathways to meet the source reduction, recycling rate, recyclability, and compostability requirements that I outlined on the previous slide. The findings of the needs assessment will not only inform the PRO plan and budget, but also provide valuable information on immediate program planning and investment strategies for other players across the value chain. By collecting data and conducting analyses to understand potential pathways, it will help ensure that actions and investments made are evidence-based and address the varying needs and challenges faced by California's diverse communities. The needs assessment also lays the groundwork for future research and innovation by identifying areas where data is currently sparse and areas where there may be future opportunities. Next slide, please. Broadly, the needs assessment analysis looked at what is happening with covered material now and what needs to happen in the future to meet requirements. The assessment of the current state of the system looked at current covered material design, access to and participation in existing programs and infrastructure, material flows through current system, sources and impacts of contamination, location and impacts of infrastructure, as well as consumer education and outreach. The assessment of the needed state of the system was built upon the findings of the current state, including how covered material design can help achieve the requirements of the Act. It identified actions producers and interested parties across the value chain may take to reduce, reuse, recycle, and compost covered material. It also identified barriers to and factors that enable behavior change, creation of new and expanded infrastructure, and implementation of programs. The actions and investments identified in the needs assessment are not meant to be prescriptive. They are meant to illustrate how different strategies and investments provide opportunities across the entire system to achieve the requirements of the Act. I went over the scope of the needs assessment at a high level in the previous two slides. Now I will delve into some more detail. The needs assessment consists of several studies to address the requirements established in PRC Section 42067 E2-3. Two of the statutory provisions outlining the required analyses of the needs assessment were broad and were applicable to multiple of the needs assessment studies. These were 42067 E2F, Consumer Education Needs for Recycling, Composting, Reuse and Reduction, and 2G, Funding Needs and Actions Necessary to Achieve the Requirements of this chapter. The next listed statutory provisions were applicable to the collection, processing, and end market study. These include 2A, previous slide please. 2A, existing state statutory provisions and funding sources related to market development and financial incentives to help achieve the state's goals related to recycling, composting, reuse, reduction, and recovery. 2B, the current recycling, composting, collection, and hauling system in the state, and the expanded access and additional recycling or composting options needed for enhancements to the system. 2C, the existing access to on-premises recycling and composting for multifamily residences and the need to expand that access. Next slide, please. 2D, the processing capacity and infrastructure in the state and regionally, and the ability for innovative and advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence and robotics to improve that capacity. 2E, current market conditions and the need to create viable, responsible end markets in the state and regionally. 2H, actions and investments necessary to provide sufficient access to collection, recycling, composting, processing, and transportation to viable, responsible end markets. 2I, an evaluation of the availability or lack of availability of markets for recycled covered material, the need to incentivize recycled or composted material market development, and the associated investments and actions needed to ensure that the covered materials are recycled or composted and have viable and sufficient responsible end markets to meet the requirements of Section 42050. 2J, factors contributing to contamination and actions and investments needed to avoid contamination and improve recycled and composted material in order to ensure the material meets quality requirements for remanufacturing. Further statutory provisions applicable to the collection, processing, and end market study include 2K, availability of responsible end markets and mechanisms to identify and expand responsible end markets. The evaluation shall include identification of measures to avoid and minimize environmental and public health impacts on communities where recycling occurs. 3A, the needs associated with shifting packaging or food serviceware from a covered material category that is unlikely to develop sustained, viable, responsible end markets to a covered material category that either has a viable, responsible end market or is likely to develop a sustained, viable, responsible end market. 3B, actions and investments necessary to improve covered material design to improve recyclability and compostability. 3D, an evaluation of integrating innovative and advanced technologies throughout a MRF that utilize artificial intelligence to improve data collection in order to identify, categorize, and track the disposition of covered materials throughout the recycling process. Continuing the statutory provisions for the collection, processing, and end market study. Previous slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. The next set of statutory provisions pertain to the source reduction baseline and the source reduction and material design study. These include 3C, funding needed to implement the source reduction requirements established in Section 42057, including but not limited to investments needed to develop reuse and refill infrastructure and to provide consumers with convenient access to that infrastructure to grow and market the reuse of reusable and refillable packaging and food serviceware. 3E, an evaluation of actions and investments that would be effective in achieving source reduction requirements. The next set of statutory provisions apply to the consumer education and access study. These include 2C, the existing access to on-premises recycling and composting for multifamily residences and the need to expand that access. And lastly, 2F, consumer education needs for recycling, composting, reuse, and reduction. Other needs assessment requirements in statute include PRC 42070G. The advisory board shall review any needs assessment submitted to it within 90 calendar days of receipt of the needs assessment. PRC 42051.1B1. The PRO plan shall include the actions and investments that the PRO will implement in order to meet the requirements of this chapter and address the needs and investments identified in the needs assessment. The needs assessment was developed through a series of contracted studies and work conducted by CalRecycle. New data collection and analysis was completed through 4 contracted studies over the past couple of years. Existing data, including CalRecycle data, was used, such as RDRS, the Electronic Annual Report EAR data, SB 343, and SB 54 MCS data. Another important source of data and information was engagement with interested parties throughout the entire process, including the Producer Responsibility Organization, the Packaging Producer Responsibility Advisory Board, local jurisdictions, material recovery facilities, organics processing facilities, haulers and recycling service providers, community-based organizations, environmental justice groups, Native American tribes, as well as other interested parties. The first statewide needs assessment culminated in a series of published reports. The first report published as part of the needs assessment was a source reduction baseline study, which was published at the end of 2024. We will provide a high-level overview of the findings from that study at this information session. More recently, 4 total reports were published on collection, processing, and end markets, 3 outlining the current state of the system, and 1 on the needed state. 2 reports were published on source reduction and material design, 1 on the current state and 1 on the needed state. More details on those reports will be given by my colleagues later in this session. Finally, a report was published on the Consumer Education and Access Study, which were the findings from a representative survey of Californians. This will also be discussed later in the session. CalRecycle has scheduled 2 information sessions on the needs assessment in April to go over key findings. Today's session will focus on the source reduction requirements, including reuse refill. My colleagues will go over the findings from the source reduction baseline study, source reduction material design, current state and needed state reports, as well as the findings pertinent to source reduction, reuse, and refill from the Consumer Education and Access Study. The second informational session, scheduled for April 14th, will focus on recycling rate, recyclability, and compostability requirements. This session will include findings from the CPEM, or Collection, Processing, and End Markets, current and needed state reports, as well as findings pertinent to recycling and composting from the Consumer Education and Access Study. More details on this informational session will be available through our listserv. We encourage anybody tuning in to please sign up for our listserv. As previously mentioned, CalRecycle published a summary report. The summary report provides highlights from each needs assessment report and links findings across the reports. It also includes information on how the first recycling rates for covered materials were estimated, which was based on some findings from the needs assessment, as well as information collected during the recently published material characterization study. It also provides information on existing programs and laws that intersect with the Act. I will provide a few highlights from the summary report over the next few slides. First, one of the main findings was that solutions that work for all are necessary to allow for widespread adoption. Creating a system built for everyone, rather than only offering a specialty or niche option, will allow for more sustainable and equitable change. Early investments that make sustainable choices accessible within existing shopping patterns, leveraging inclusive design processes combined with long-term infrastructure that reduces costs and increases convenience, can ensure systems work for all communities. The upstream decisions made by manufacturers and producers about the composition and design of covered material also will have widespread downstream impacts on the actions and investments needed. Material design changes play a critical role in this transition. Simplification, standardization, and harmonization of covered materials can streamline the entire supply chain, reducing costs, improving public health, and delivering environmental benefits. Another finding of the needs assessment is that different types of covered material currently have varying levels of collection, processing, and recycling across the state. Similarly, there are varying levels of access to reusable, refillable, and source-reduced alternatives. Access to services varies by community. However, lower income and rural communities were found to be less likely to have access to recycling services and source-reduced alternatives. Additionally, infrastructure that handles covered material is commonly located in areas identified as already carrying high pollution burdens, which can overlap with communities that have little access to recycling services. And specific to recycling, the collection and processing of covered material for recycling is highly dependent on end markets, including that material has sufficient market value and the stability of that value. Another highlight of the needs assessment is that education and outreach across the entire value chain will be important for influencing change across the system. This includes education ranging from consumers to decision makers along the supply chain. Education and outreach could be further simplified and made more effective if coupled with covered material design changes, simplifying behavior changes. As previously noted, material design choices influence whether an item can be effectively collected, sorted, and sent to end markets. Reducing the types and complexity of covered material in the market is expected to make it easier for consumers to properly sort covered material, which in turn can simplify education and outreach needs, resulting in reduced contamination and improved recycling yields. Those were some of the highlights from the summary report. In the next set of the slides in this presentation, some of my colleagues will be presenting the findings from the different reports. Amber Lau will present the findings from the Consumer Education and Access Report as it pertains to source reduction, reuse, and refill. Vanessa Cervantes from the Knowledge Integration section will be presenting findings from the Source Reduction Baseline Study. Rachel Messina from the Knowledge Integration section will be presenting findings from the current state of the Source Reduction and Material Design Study, followed by Lexi Tufo from the Packaging EPR section, who will be presenting findings from the needed state of the Source Reduction and Material Design Study. I will now pass it over to Amber to go into the details from the CEA study.
Thank you, Priya. We're now going to give a high-level summary of findings by study. So I will start by giving some information on the Consumer Education and Access study. Education and access related to source reduction, reuse and refill, recycling and composting was assessed in multiple studies through various ways for different purposes. A representative survey of Californians was developed and completed to assess education and access in the Consumer Education and Access study. Because a representative sample of Californians were surveyed, it allows for statistical and other analysis to be performed on that data set to get findings that represent Californians. To engage further with community members and community-based organizations, listening sessions were used for the source reduction and material design study, as well as the collection, processing, and end market study. Surveys focusing on priority populations were also used in the collection, processing, and end market study. Finally, the source reduction and material design study contractor attended community and pop-up events. The Consumer Education and Access study consists of an internally developed statewide survey, which focuses on evaluating consumer knowledge of and participation in recycling, composting, source reduction, and reuse activities. The survey investigates consumer access to waste collection and source reduction activities and how people receive information about those activities, as well as waste sorting behaviors, habits, and motivations. So now I'll go over some key details in relation to the source reduction part of the survey. 2,297 adult California residents were surveyed. This number includes demographic quota groups to ensure proper representation of California's adult population, including meeting quotas for certain priority populations, which allowed for comparisons between groups, such as differences between rural versus urban and suburban communities, multifamily properties versus single-family homes, as well as respondents with different levels of household income. The study identified consumer need for education, interest in learning about single-use plastic reduction, and priority populations that engage in different source reduction activities. Findings from the source reduction portion of the survey include reuse and refill, as well as other source reduction strategies that are applicable to covered material. Now we'll go over some key findings regarding source reduction from the Consumer Education and Access study. A majority of respondents participate in nearly all of the following source reduction activities to some degree. 74% purchase products in bulk packaging, 67% choose products with minimal or no plastic packaging, 64% purchase concentrated products, 55% opt out of plastic single-use food serviceware, 53% buy products by weight at the bulk section of a store. 53% bring returnable and/or refillable containers back to participating locations, and 38% purchase products at refill stores. Participants cited environmental benefits, reduced packaging waste, and lower overall costs to be benefits of source reduction. Financial incentives and greater availability of products were found to be the biggest motivating factors for higher participation in source reduction. Low income and rural respondents were found to be less likely to participate in source reduction than urban residents. And regarding education and outreach, respondents currently receive information on ways to reduce the use of single-use plastics through a variety of methods led by the internet, then product labels, and then mail. Their preference for receiving information aligned with how it is currently received. Their sources of information for source reduction strategies currently come from city and county sources, waste hauler sources, and state agency sources, and their preferred information source aligned with those three as well. So that is a short overview of the Consumer Education and Access Study. I'll now pass it over to Vanessa Cervantes to speak on the next topic.
The next topic we are covering today is a source reduction baseline. As mentioned earlier, this was the first needs assessment published by CalRecycle on December 31st, 2024. The source reduction baseline serves as the foundation for later source reduction studies because it establishes the initial benchmark by which producers will measure their source reduction progress. Source reduction refers to reducing the amount of plastic used in covered materials. As such, source reduction is measured by two metrics. First, by the number of plastic components, and secondly, by the weight of plastic-covered material sold, offered for sale, or distributed in the state. It is important to note that the weight of plastic-covered material refers only to the weight of the plastic portion of covered material in instances where the covered material includes non-plastic elements, for example, glass, metal, or paper. Producers are able to achieve the goals and requirements set forth in statute by utilizing source reduction strategies, including reuse and refill, and other source reduction strategies, including concentration, elimination, lightweighting, material substitution, optimization, and right-sizing. In order to provide a pathway to achieving these goals and pursuant to PRC Section 42057B, the department established the baseline for single-use plastic packaging and food serviceware sold, offered for sale, or distributed in the state in 2023. The baseline was estimated through the creation of three models: the single-use plastic packaging model, the single-use plastic food serviceware model, and the single-use plastic packaging for single-use plastic food serviceware model. The study identified representative products and representative meals that each model used to estimate the amount of plastic-covered material in the baseline year. The sum of the estimates from all three models resulted in the source reduction baseline. In total, it was estimated that 171.4 billion plastic components weighing 2.9 million tons were sold, offered for sale, or distributed in California in 2023. Of that, single-use plastic packaging contributed 2.4 million tons and 84 billion plastic components, while single-use plastic food serviceware contributed 0.49 million tons of plastic and 87.4 billion plastic components to the overall baseline. This analysis demonstrated that the single-use plastic packaging and single-use plastic food serviceware contributed nearly an equal amount to the number of plastic components in the baseline. However, single-use plastic packaging contributed a higher proportion of the plastic weight, approximately 83%. The overall findings, specifically the total weight of plastic-covered material and number of plastic components, later serve as the basis for the modeling seen in the source reduction and material design study.
All right, so that leads us to our next section, in which we will review the source reduction and material design study and corresponding reports. As noted in earlier slides, SB 54 requires that the producer responsibility organization work with industry to reach source reduction goals for single-use plastic packaging and single-use plastic food serviceware. So by 2027, the PRO must achieve no less than a 10% source reduction of plastic covered material, with no less than 2% of plastic covered material being source reduced through shifting to reusable or refillable items. By 2030, the PRO shall source reduce by no less than 20%, with no less than 4% of plastic covered material being source reduced through shifting to reusable or refillable forms. And by 2032, the source reduction of at least 25% must be achieved, with at least 10% of source reduction resulting from shifting the plastic covered material to reuse and refill or through elimination of a plastic component. The SRMD study aimed to evaluate the current state and identify actions and investments needed to achieve these source reduction requirements. This study resulted in 2 reports, which are the evaluation of reuse and refill systems and cover materials that utilize other source reduction strategies, which we more commonly refer to as the current state report, and the analysis of actions and investments needed to achieve source reduction goals, which we refer to as the needed state report. We will highlight the purpose and key findings from each report in the subsequent slides. So we'll begin by reviewing the current state report. The current state report focuses on evaluating the source reduction strategies actively used in California, current availability of reuse and refill infrastructure, and identifies opportunities and barriers for scaling reuse and refill, centering on access, participation, costs, and community impacts across the state's diverse regions. This report provides further details and information on reuse, refill, and other source reduction strategies based on information gathered from expert interviews, the analysis of reusable food serviceware in randomly sampled dine-in restaurants, and an assessment of California retailer options. In addition to engagement with industry experts, the study also included community engagement with various individuals and community-based organizations, which we discuss further in the following slide. So community engagement was conducted using various approaches. The purpose of this engagement was to gain insight on current source reduction strategies used, access to reuse and refill systems, and to identify opportunities and barriers for scaling reuse and refill from communities representing the diverse California population. Engagement was conducted with community members through focus groups, as well as booths and bilingual engagement boards at in-person events to understand the perspectives of urban, suburban, and rural communities across California. Small group discussions were also used to facilitate open dialogue with tribal members, representatives from community-based organizations, as well as members from the disability community. The efforts for the current state report for SRMD involved 42 industry and expert interviews, which included feedback on source reduction from large and small scale sports venues, restaurants, retailers, and manufacturers. The creation of a food serviceware establishment data set, which assessed the use of single-use and durable food serviceware across randomly sampled dine-in restaurants in California. Also, the creation of an instances and solution data set, which cataloged business-to-business and business-to-consumer reuse and refill, and enabler solutions in operation in California. And last, the creation of a California store-level data set, which examined the availability of source reduction options for 5 widely used products, which include white rice, surface cleaner, shampoo, milk, and dish soap. So these data, along with insights from community engagement, were assessed to identify the current state of source reduction for California. We will be going over the key findings from SRMD's current state report over the next 4 slides. So key findings related to reuse and refill include goods in reuse and refill packaging and food serviceware solutions were found to be a small fraction of what is available on the market today, though there is demand for solutions, and access to in-store reuse and refill options is limited, especially in disadvantaged communities. So these studies found that about 35% of California's urban population live within 1 mile of a store with at least some in-store refill. Only 4% of Californians live within a mile of an all refill store, and 26% live near a store with some refill options available. Some other key findings from SRMD's current state report are that reuse and refill require new systems to scale, while other source reduction strategies generally build on existing systems. Pre-fill reuse systems show strong scalability, and reusable food serviceware and business-to-business reuse are promising, though they are in early stages. So as a quick bit of helpful information, B2B is designed to be purchased by larger customers like businesses and often include goods sold in larger format packaging or bulk sizes. The SRMD current state report highlights barriers and opportunities for reuse and refill systems, including the three main barriers, which are consumer habit and convenience norms, operational and cost complexity, and potential for negative perceptions and brand impacts. Opportunities to expand reuse and refill include starting with closed loop in B2B reuse, standardizing packaging in food serviceware, building capacity through hubs and contract manufacturers and fillers, and enabling public collection through shared infrastructure. So here we have key findings from the SRMD current state report related to other source reduction strategies that are not reuse and refill. So for these other source reduction strategies, this study found that they are widespread but face some barriers. So examples of these barriers include technical limits for lightweighting and material substitution, equipment and process constraints, consumer acceptance challenges, and gaps in cost and market incentives. On the other hand, opportunities for source reduction include advancing research and design for reformulation in alternative materials, implementing right sizing and lightweighting, and establishing market incentives and cost sharing mechanisms. Now I'll pass it over to Lexi.
Thanks, Rachel. Now we'll move on to the source reduction and material design needed state report. The focus of this report is to identify potential approaches and the associated actions and investments needed to achieve the source reduction requirements. Key findings from this report include the development of 2 source reduction pathways to illustrate potential opportunities for achieving source reduction, that new and updated infrastructure is required, and that material design changes and innovations are critical for source reduction. This is a brief overview of the methodology used for this latter half of the source reduction study. The strategies reviewed in the current state were consolidated. The source reduction baseline was further analyzed to understand the contributions to the baseline by sales channel, plastic use, and plastic format. The consolidated source reduction strategies were scored with various criteria to prioritize ones with the highest potential. Then these strategies were used within 2 pathways, which were both designed to meet the source reduction targets. Finally, the actions and investments needed to follow these pathways, including their relative costs, were determined. Let's look into each of these steps in a little more detail. Based on the reuse and refill taxonomy from the current state of source reduction report, strategies were consolidated for assessing source reduction potential for the needed state and included 3 main categories: reuse and refill strategies, other source reduction strategies, and alternative compliance. Reuse and refill strategies included refill in store, pre-fill, which refers to the use of reusable packaging, which was returned by consumers, refilled, and recirculated by the producer in both the business to consumer and business to business contexts. Closed loop reusable food serviceware, in which the food or beverage is consumed in the same location that it was purchased, such as a stadium or cafeteria. Open loop reusable food serviceware, in which the food or beverage is consumed elsewhere, such as restaurant takeout. Business to consumer e-commerce transport packaging, and business to business transport packaging. Other source reduction strategies included lightweighting, elimination, right sizing, concentration, large format, and material substitution. Lastly, alternative compliance, as outlined by statute in Public Resource Code 42057-2BI, is limited to the use of post-consumer recycled content. This study used the overall baseline findings calculated in the source reduction baseline study published by CalRecycle at the end of 2024. We would like to emphasize that the adapted baseline is not new baseline, but was instead further analyzed to have a more granular breakdown of what made up the weight and number of plastic component values. This breakdown included understanding contributions from business to business versus business to consumer, what the functions were of the covered material, meaning primary, secondary, tertiary packaging or food serviceware, and what the format was of the covered material, i.e., was it a cup or a utensil. The adapted baseline allowed source reduction baseline findings to remain constant while recalculating the contributions of plastic for the categories specifically developed for this study. The graph on the right shows the estimated contributions for the adapted baseline. Packaging contributed a larger proportion to the weight of plastic, while number of plastic components had a more similar distribution between food serviceware and packaging. After consolidating source reduction strategies into the previously mentioned list, the study aimed to identify and evaluate the types of goods most suitable for reuse and refill strategies and the types of goods most suitable for packaging formats and food serviceware for implementing other source reduction strategies. This was accomplished by giving weighted scores to good clusters developed by the study based on how feasible each strategy might be for those clusters. This feasibility was based on both technical and implementation and impact feasibility. Technical feasibility was based on criteria including whether goods contained harsh chemicals, whether goods require high functionality packaging, whether goods require specific handling conditions, and whether goods have a particular or specific physical characteristic. Implementation and impact feasibility was based on criteria such as what proportion of the adapted baseline the goods represented, meaning the contribution that the clusters or groupings had to the overall number of plastic components or plastic weight in the baseline, operational readiness, and user acceptance. The source reduction pathways were built using the outcomes of the strategy prioritization scoring. The scoring determined the extent to which each strategy is utilized in each of the two pathways. These two plausible scenarios demonstrate different combinations of strategies, but both achieve the statutory source reduction goals. The pathways each have a different emphasis. Material substitution and reuse refill are two of the only strategies that substantially reduce both the weight and number of plastic components at the same time. Pathway A represents the substitution emphasis pathway, which relies heavily on shifting to non-plastic alternatives, while pathway B represents the reuse emphasis pathway, which prioritizes various reuse refill strategies like pre-fill, reusable food serviceware, and business-to-business reuse systems. In pathway A, you can see for both weight on the top and plastic components on the bottom, the majority of source reduction is achieved by material substitution. Switching materials to closed-loop food serviceware, i.e. reusing reusable utensils and cups in restaurants, represents a significant portion as well, which contributes significantly to achieving the reuse and refill specific targets in statute. When you compare that to pathway B, material substitution still has a significant contribution, but closed-loop food serviceware and pre-fill business-to-business, which are both categorized under reuse refill strategies, represent much more of the overall source reduction efforts. The reuse refill target is exceeded, which contributes to both reducing weight and number of components. Let's review some key findings. Source reduction strategies. For source reduction strategies, not all of the strategies will have an impact on both the weight of the plastic covered material and the number of components. Single-use plastic packaging, driven by business-to-business, accounted for the majority of plastic weight, while single-use plastic food serviceware accounted for the majority of plastic components. Some source reduction strategies have higher potential to reduce the weight and the number of plastic components, and material substitution, elimination, and lightweighting for both business-to-business and business-to-consumer covered material were identified to be the most effective in reducing the weight of plastic covered material and the number of plastic components. For reuse and refill, closed-loop food serviceware and pre-filled business-to-business contexts were identified as strategies likely to be the most effective in meeting requirements for reuse and refill. Continuing with our key findings, we've highlighted some specific actions, investments, and opportunities found in this report. We have the opportunity to design a system to build a durable and equitable change for everyone. Sustainable choices accessible within the existing shopping patterns, inclusive design processes, long-term infrastructure that reduces costs and increased convenience can ensure reuse and refill works for all. Reuse and refill infrastructure development was also estimated to create between 2,700 and 5,400 jobs in the state. A key action to achieve the plastic component-based reduction targets requires either substantial material substitution, significant reuse adoption, or a combination of both. Closed-loop systems and business-to-business reuse systems can be used as starting points to build infrastructure that support future expansion to open-loop systems and business-to-consumer contexts. It will be important to identify and collaborate with key enablers, especially for short-term infrastructure needs. Finally, we should leverage co-packers and contract manufacturers who already operate at scale and have the expertise, equipment, and regulatory compliance systems to handle food-grade packaging. I'll pass it to Dan Brown for our closing comments.
Great, thank you, Lexi. To learn more about the program and our implementation efforts, please sign up for our listserv. CalRecycle is hosting another information session on the needs assessment on April 14th from 2 to 4, which will cover reports related to recyclability, compostability, and recycling rate requirements, as well as the recycling and composting portion of the consumer education and access study. If you have questions, comments, or feedback on the needs assessment, please email us at packaging@calrecycle.ca.gov. And then before we turn it over to a question and answer session, we are going to take a 5-minute break. Let's call it a 7-minute break. So we will return at 2:55, and at that time, we'll start our questions and answers.